who have been convicted, and you are trying to revisit the case, bring it back to the court, and have the attention and the light shine back on it. And in case after case after case after case, I was seeing police misconduct. I was seeing prosecutors who were unwilling to do the work of justice. And I was seeing who was suffering: poor white people and people of color, almost 201. And that experience was phenomenal. It was also incredibly traumatic, because part of what you start to realize is that your work is just spitting into the ocean in a lot of ways. It just doesn't feel like there's enough. There's not enough resource, and there's just not enough time to get to all of the people who need your help. And so when you see that on that kind of micro level, what it blows up on the macro level is that the system is deeply, deeply dysfunctional. And we all know that. It's clear, and in some superficial ways, but what started to happen is that all of the blinders came off, and what I saw was the dysfunction was the point. The dysfunction was the act, and the dysfunction is what is being buttressed by the system itself. And so put a call into Amol. We talked about some stuff. There was a spot open. I applied, and luckily I got to come to the ACLU. And so now that work has started to translate into this beautiful kind of synergy between the legal act, the arguing at the Supreme Court, the briefing, and the policy push. So we're seeing how all of the other levers to fight against the dysfunction are moving together to create what I hope is a better New Jersey, what I hope is a fairer New Jersey, and what I hope is a New Jersey where all of those in the criminal justice system, which is not so just, will be able to be held accountable, and that we actually will be able to make it functional.
Thanks so much, Karen, for sharing your inspiring story and what led you to engage in your advocacy and leadership in the justice space. And I'd love to hear your poetry sometime, by the way. With that, I'm going to introduce our last panelist, Alexis Carteron. She's an associate professor of law at Rutgers Law School, where she directs the Rutgers Constitutional Rights Clinic. The clinic engages in litigation and legal advocacy concerning a range of constitutional and civil rights issues, with a focus on issues concerning mass incarceration and the criminal legal system. Alexis, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's such a treat to be here again with some of my favorite people working on such important issues. I'll also share really briefly what has led me to be interested in this work and focused on policing in particular. So unlike Karen, I had absolutely no artistic streak and went to law school right after college pretty much because I wanted to follow in the footsteps of Thurgood Marshall. I wanted to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I had this dream and hope that the legal system could be put to work to vindicate the rights of marginalized people, particularly the Black community in the United States. And I was all about voting rights at the time. Love the issue. It's hard to imagine that this is nearly 20 years ago now, that it was not really in the news quite as much as it is now, but it still just captured my imagination and was exactly what I wanted to do. So I ended up having that dream. I went to LDF, I worked on voting rights issues, but then I also, because this is the Princeton Community Democratic Organization, I will tell you all that I had Obama fever. And I was like, I must go to Washington, DC and work in the Obama administration. And somehow that worked out. And I worked at the White House for a little while. But I wasn't working as a lawyer, and I really missed practicing law. So next I went to the New York Civil Liberties Union, which, as Amol mentioned, we met there, we're co-workers there. And the first case I was assigned as a staff attorney at the NYCLU was this policing case. And it was about school security officers in New York City, and basically about them abusing kids and arresting kids when they had not in fact done anything wrong, or they had really engaged in what was probably appropriate, often teenage misbehavior, but instead of getting sent to a principal's office or getting sent home from school early or even being suspended, they were getting arrested, they were getting beat up by school safety agents. They were having cases that lasted for a really long time. And for me personally, it was the beginning of a journey to really deepen my understanding of mass incarceration and how it functions in the United States. I would say the typical legal education leaves one thinking about everything being adjudicated on an individual level. There's one criminal defendant. What did he or she do? How does the criminal law apply to that person? What kind of protections are offered by the Constitution, maybe the Fourth Amendment, but not really thinking about it as a mass phenomenon. And I actually say I'm actually even a little embarrassed thinking back how much I knew the term mass incarceration. I had the luck to take a class with Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, which is a book that I imagine a lot of people who are involved in this organization are familiar with and maybe have read. So even though I was a student of Michelle Alexander, and even though I was exposed to these ideas, they really hadn't kind of taken hold in my mind as the crisis that I think it really is, and the stain on the United States that it really is, where we have 2 million people in prison. And beyond that, we have another 2.5 million people who are under carceral control in some way or another, on probation or parole or some form of community supervision. And it's a mass phenomenon, obviously, with those kinds of numbers, millions of people in prison, but it all starts with policing. And I think it's so important that we talk about policing and mass incarceration in the same breath, because they go hand in hand. So I've already mentioned that, for some it begins with encounters in schools. And obviously it's not, in every school where there are armed police officers roaming the halls, but I think there are far too many. And for other people, those encounters begin with traffic stops when they start driving, perhaps as a teenager or a young adult. For some people, there are encounters with police officers when they just are stopped and frisked when they're walking down the street. And I think all too often those interactions go bad. And, obviously we hear mostly about the really extreme ones, the really outrageous ones, the ones that generate videos that get watched again and again and again. But there's so much more than that, that really all feeds into this just incredible system where, again, we have millions of people under carceral control in this country. So sometimes it's just a ticket and maybe no one leaves with really bad feelings, but it's still a process that takes time, that takes money, and can create records that infringe upon people or limit people as they go along and try to build their lives. Sometimes it actually is time in jail or time in prison. And I think, the thing that the cases that I worked on at the NYCLU about policing really taught me was how much these things that we regard as minor, again, just a ticket, just one night in jail, are deeply traumatizing for people at times. And even if they're not traumatizing, they can be extremely disruptive. People who lose jobs, people who lose time with their family, people who have to spend months and months and months going to court to fight even minor charges. And I just really think it's madness, and it's a cost that's only imposed on some people. I think we know all too well that it really happens to people at the bottom mostly. And for some of us, even though we may be well educated, I still have been pulled over for supposedly having a broken taillight. I mean, the first question asked of me was where I was going and where I was coming from. So we know exactly how this works. We know that race is an important part of it. So I do this because I think this work is essential to, again, end the stain on our country. I also do it for my kids because, like all parents, I think my kids are just, the best. But I also know that one day they're not going to have chubby cheeks and they're not going to be looked at as, non-threatening, cute boys. One day they're going to be perceived as threats. So I hope that we can start making things better in New Jersey. We have federal legislation pending right now. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is pending in Congress, but it's so essential that we move things here locally and at the state level as well. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexis, for your incredible leadership on the issues of mass incarceration and policing, and really for talking about, the human impact of what occurs in normal everyday police what is considered normal everyday police interactions, and how that really impacts people and their lives on a day-to-day basis. I really appreciate you raising that. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our distinguished moderator who's going to be moderating tonight's panel, Raisa, Rubin, Stankiewicz. We are so honored and proud to have Raisa be a part of our board. She is the youngest member of the PCDO's executive board, and she is a member of the advocacy committee and state co-director for March for Our Lives in New Jersey. She has led many social justice efforts here locally in Princeton and statewide as well. And I'm thrilled to have her moderate this panel tonight. And with that, Raisa, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Afsheen. And thank you so much to our incredible panel for starting us off with those stories. We will jump right into it with our first question, which is, what do you think should be the state's priorities on the issue of police accountability, and what gaps need to be filled most? And whomever would like to start may start.
I can start, and then I'm gonna I can point both ways because I think CJ has a prong of this and Alexis has a prong too. So the first issue is that we need police transparency. So CJ will take that up a little bit later. The second is that we need to embrace civilian involvement to help with police accountability. Right? And the third is I think that we need to end qualified immunity nationwide, but we can also just end it in New Jersey because as Alexis mentioned, even though there is a bill currently in front of the Congress, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill, there's some things that we just don't agree with. You can't have a justice and policing bill and then give infinitely more money to police to do exactly what they've been doing all along. I'm happy that we have a Justice Department that might now be going back in to examine police conduct like they will be doing in Minnesota, but it's not enough. We've seen the same efforts. We've seen the same kind of doubling down on really tried and true tactics, and it's not working. What we are also seeing though, and what the unfortunate reality of George Floyd's murder is showing us, is that there are new ways possible. And Brooklyn Center in Minnesota just passed a phenomenal new law that said no armed officers can be involved in low-level stops, traffic stops, that no police officers can be involved in mental health safety calls. And there's a third thing, Amol, I don't know if you remember that I'm forgetting, but there's another way that Brooklyn Center has basically taken these kind of excuses to start criminal investigations, these excuses of using vague kind of general legal principles to effect stops, to make those contacts, they're taking that away. And so when we take away these excuses for contacts with police and the individuals of the states, we create space for there to be more equity. We create distance between the possibility of misconduct and what is true policing. Because what we do know is that all of these low-level stops, they're not actually solving crimes. And meanwhile, we have rape kits, we have murders that are going unsolved that police actually should be devoting their attention to. So I think I went a bit abroad of the question, but I think that would be my first attempt to fix it.
Yeah, I would just add, I think all of the things that we'll talk about tonight in terms of accountability are things that are working within the currents, assuming the system stays the same, that we're going to have police patrolling the streets. And so we want to make sure that we can see their misconduct records and that we have some civilian oversight in the records and in their discipline, and that we can hold them liable by lawsuits. But there's this larger question of what role we want police to even play in our society. And so I think that we often think too small, and it's nice to see, sadly, in other states and not in New Jersey, our own progressive organizations are not doing this work, are not enough of them are leading on this issue, but to really think differently about how we don't need the level of police that we have if we need the same entity called the police. Maybe we need something completely different, but I think sometimes we have a hard time wrapping our minds around such huge change. And so what we're talking about tonight are working within this system. What are ways in which we can reform it and make it a little bit better? But I think what we know is it's still not enough. It's definitely still not enough. My hope is that it sort of gets us to move the conversation along some more, as a first step.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, CJ. There will be an opportunity. I just want to say at the very end, we're going to ask about sort of reimagining the police and what that might look like, or what you would envision that looking like. So I really appreciate you giving kind of that framework for a broader discussion. All right, does anyone else want to add anything on this point, or?
I'll just jump in really fast on qualified immunity that Karen already mentioned, in part because I think it's going to be in the news quite a bit this week. So maybe I'll just spend a minute explaining what it is in case folks in the audience aren't aware. So qualified immunity is a doctrine that basically applies to all government officials and allows immunity from lawsuits in response to civil rights claims and other claims brought under Section 1983, which is kind of the all-purpose federal statute that people can use to vindicate their constitutional rights against government officials. And the way that qualified immunity was created by the Supreme Court, it's not something that's written in the statute. And I think it's fair to say there's a lot of concern from many corners, both left and right, that it has been stretched well beyond its initial purposes. And now it is allowing too many government officials, and particularly police officers, to not be held liable for misconduct that most people would agree is clearly unconstitutional, that is in some cases even fairly outrageous, but because it does not meet the kind of neat four corners of past precedent, people are allowed to walk away from civil liability. So it's a topic that's been under great discussion lately. It's something that it seems like, in the last week and certainly in the coming week is going to be under discussion regarding the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But as Karen mentioned, it's also something that every state can, in fact, eliminate qualified immunity for its own state law claims. So putting aside the federal statute, most states, including New Jersey, also provide some vehicle for vindicating constitutional rights. And we can get rid of it in New Jersey right now for state-based claims. So I think that will be very important. It certainly does not solve all the issues, but it would be a really valuable step to bringing some measure of accountability to unconstitutional policing.
Thank you so much for that definition of qualified immunity. That's really wonderful. And that actually brings us, I think a good next question would be, what is the current status of efforts to eliminate qualified immunity in New Jersey?
I'll go again. There are currently two very kind of nascent feudal bills in the legislature that might be coming up for consideration. We at the ACLU are actually working on some draft legislation for the state. We happen to be a little bit lucky as New Jersey because we have something called the Civil Rights Act, which has already given a cause of action for any person in New Jersey to bring against a government official who, acting in their role as a government official, violates their civil or constitutional rights. So that's already a framework. And the hope is that part of that framework will also include ending qualified immunity, so that if a claim is brought under that particular statutory provision, that police officers, government officials in general can't say, no, you can't sue me. So the hope is that the drumbeat is going to get louder and louder, and that these two bills, which again, they're kind of in this embryonic phase, that they will be robust and hardy and become a real tool to allowing or disallowing qualified immunity being this absolute kind of immunity from any sort of accountability in the courts. And we're going to talk about it later, but there's some things that everybody on this call could do that involve calling your legislators, writing them. And so we have a tool and we will share that with you later, but you can call your folks and tell them they need to undo qualified immunity and several other things to advance the cause of justice.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. Obviously the other legislation that you mentioned regarding giving the public access to police misconduct records and, you know, strengthening civilian review boards. We're also part of that really important platform that ACLU New Jersey is pushing. So if I can ask, why are these important for police accountability, and what are some of the hurdles that you see for getting them through the state legislature?
I will address that. So just to back up, when we talk about police disciplinary records, I think it's helpful to know how police discipline works. And so terms that we talk about a lot are internal affairs records, and that's really part of what this bill does. Internal affairs is how in every state, including New Jersey, police departments, that's how internal affairs unit is what investigates complaints. So if you have a bad encounter with a police officer, if they use excessive force against you, if they use racist language against you, if they do anything that you deem to be a violation of your rights, you can file a complaint with the internal affairs unit of the police department, and every police department has one. The internal affairs unit is the officers' coworkers. They know who they are. They've worked with them. It's someone was started out of the bottom and got elevated into that position. So you file the complaint, and so then the officer's own coworkers are going to investigate this complaint and determine whether or not it's sustained or not sustained. And there's a couple different categories of the not sustained. But what we know so those records are completely shrouded in secrecy. We don't have any access to know what the complaints were against a particular officer, what the outcomes against a particular officer is, who the complainant was, nothing. It's all a secret. The town government, doesn't even get to know. It's all within the police department. What we know from stats is that very, very few complaints are ever sustained. And so I looked at Mercer County, and over a 10-year period, 5 excessive force complaints out of 325 complaints, so that's 1.5%, were sustained. And 3 out of 163 differential treatment complaints, which are allegations of discrimination, were sustained. So that's 1.8%. So basically, the police have this secret system where the public doesn't get to know anything other than this raw stat. And they investigate their coworkers, they clear them of wrongdoing, and we don't get to know about any of it. And then of this 1 to 2% that's actually sustained, there's some level of discipline that may or may not be imposed, and that's all a secret too. And so that is obviously problematic, because more than 1.8% of those complaints should be sustained. And if there was any sort of outside oversight, we would know that there would be a higher sustained rate. And the reason why I can say that is because in agencies where there's been like federal monitoring, I'm talking state police and city of Newark, they have much higher sustained rates of complaints. They are closer to the 15 to 20%, which is still probably too low, but better than these agencies that are doing 1%. And so this in New Jersey is out of sync with a lot of states across the nation. So Florida, New York, Georgia, Ohio, Colorado, all of these places, a total of 28 states, are more transparent than New Jersey. In Florida, you can go to many police department websites, you can see the outcomes of their internal affairs complaints, and then you can just put in a request to look at the entire file. And when you look at the file, then you can say, okay, here's what efforts they made, here's what to investigate, here's what the evidence is. We agree or disagree with the finding. And what you find in New Jersey is that many complaints are not sustained because they were administratively dismissed, which means they for whatever reason, couldn't conduct the investigation to a conclusion. They couldn't reach the witness, or they didn't make an effort to reach that witness that we've found when we've gotten files. And so this bill that ACLU and other organizations are advocating, S2656, introduced by Senator Weinberg and now has several legislative sponsors, would make internal affairs records public, as well as the disciplinary files that correlate with them public. All body cams, videos, the files themselves become public. And so we get to review them, provide outside oversight. It's the equivalent of when New York last year, within 2 weeks of George Floyd's murder, they repealed 50A, which made big news. So many people have probably heard about 50A. That's what we asked New Jersey to do. Unfortunately, New Jersey has done nothing. The bill hasn't even had a hearing, which is why we are also asking local municipalities and civil rights boards to write letters, and individuals as well, write letters and let the legislature know that this is a priority. And this is one of those things where we are not asking for something revolutionary here. We're just, let's be as good as Florida on this issue. Let's not lag behind 28 different states. And so that's where we are in that. And then I'll let someone else do the CCRB piece, or I can if someone wants to, but either way.
I'll start on the CCRB piece, and I welcome my colleagues to join. But first I wanted to say a couple of things on transparency. As CJ mentioned, police should not be policing themselves, right? And that, I think, is a core component of this work. Even if we had police disciplinary history transparency, we would know more about the problems that are occurring, but the files that we would have access to would be inherently biased, right? So we need to sort of dismantle this police policing themselves structure that we have in place in New Jersey and in the United States. On CCRBs, the Civilian Complaint Review Boards, for a very long time, the ACLU of New Jersey has been working to create a meaningful and robust CCRB in Newark. In 2011, I believe, we had filed with the Department of Justice a complaint outlining a whole bunch of interactions that we recognize to be problematic in Newark. So I think we tracked something like, back to CJ's point, we tracked something like 268 complaints against Newark police to the Internal Affairs Department and Newark Police, and only one of them was sustained in a 2-year period. And then we also identified the racially disparate treatment of folks in Newark, the excessive use of force, et cetera, et cetera. The DOJ agreed to come into Newark and have a federal monitor set up. And long story short, there's a consent decree in place that requires monitoring by this federal body. Alongside that, we worked with the Newark mayor and the city council to call for a robust civilian review board. This is all in the context of oversight and the federal investigation and all of the things that we pointed to as problematic with Newark police, and the things that we worked together with then Mayor Booker, who came to embrace the model CCRB, and then after him Mayor Baraka, who really put some fuel behind it and made it come to fruition before the city council. There was a real gem of a model of a CCRB that I think would work really well if it was allowed to operate. The things that we identified as essential to a civilian complaint review board included having meaningful community representation. So there were going to be seats held for people who were from community-based organizations that actually interacted with the community in Newark. We wanted to make sure that the board had subpoena power, so it had the ability to actually conduct thorough and independent investigations, that it wouldn't be stymied by not having access to certain files, that it would be on a parallel track with the internal affairs investigation, if there was one, so that internal affairs wouldn't get access to things and make decisions on things first, and then leave it to the CCRB to only get the information that Internal Affairs decides it wants to share with them. And then lastly, excuse me, making sure that the CCRB had some sort of meaningful disciplinary power. Because what good is making disciplinary recommendations that are never actually followed by the police department? We see that in New York, which has a CCRB. More than 90% of the disciplinary recommendations that the CCRB makes is dismissed by the police commissioner and is never actually put into action. So we wanted to see those 4 elements. Immediately after the CCRB passed in Newark through the city council, the police union sued. So the Fraternal Order of the Police sued to stop it from actually being implemented. And it was tied up in litigation for a really long time. We were only able to make some limited advances to the CCRB over time. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that the Supreme Court of New Jersey decided that the CCRB, as it was originally contemplated, could not exist. And that was because state law didn't permit it to. And the Supreme Court decision actually provided us with a roadmap for what it is that we need to see change in state law so that these CCRBs can exist in meaningful ways across municipalities all across New Jersey. Right now, there are active efforts in Newark for sure, but Asbury Park, Jersey City, several communities all across the state want CCRBs. Like they really do, and they feel like their voices are not being heard because of the combination of the Supreme Court decision and the limitations of state law. So we are advocating for the CCRB bill, which would allow for these municipalities to have meaningful CCRBs and make sure that they can actually exist. And one of the things that people have said, well, you're still allowed to have a CCRB, it just can't have these little powers that you want them to have. And the problem with that is, look, I think a CCRB that is not powerful, that doesn't have those meaningful oversight tools, is worse than no CCRB at all. Because what you have then is a body that can't actually provide oversight, but the perception that there is oversight, and that's a real problem. And another thing that my mind is going faster than my mouth, but I'll go back to the transparency piece for a second. The Attorney General of our state actually tried to make some modest advancements towards transparency in recent months. He had put together a directive, an Attorney General's directive that is binding over all law enforcement in the state, which would require police departments to disclose the names of officers who had sustained allegations of misconduct, of serious misconduct, and were subject to either being fired or demoted or suspended by more than 5 days from their police posts, which, if you know how police disciplinary proceedings work, those are really serious, right? Like you are accused of something or alleged, have a sustained accusation of something that is really serious if you're being suspended by more than 5 days. Again, when the Attorney General tried to issue this directive, immediately he got 5 lawsuits against him by the police unions. And we at the ACLU and CJ and other lawyers all joined in on in defending through amicus briefs the Attorney General's directives. But what we said was, look, of course the Attorney General has the power to issue these directives and call for transparency. We don't even think he's going far enough, and we could do a whole lot more in the way of transparency. But it's really telling that the police unions are the obstructionists towards any sort of reform. They are trying to make sure that nobody gets transparency in their police departments, that they're trying to make sure that there is no such thing as reform in New Jersey, because what they perceive is that any efforts towards reform is an attack on police and their ability to do their jobs. What we think and know is that really reforms are, the police union's attempts are essentially their way of being able to cover up misconduct, and that's a real problem. So when folks ask, who are the biggest obstacles in achieving reforms in New Jersey and elsewhere, it's not necessarily the police departments themselves, it's the unions that represent the police, the police officers and the police brass that really get in the way and can put money behind and can invest in litigation against these reforms. That is really a problem. And I think it should be noted that these unions all across the country have a lot of political power, right? I should note that in the first time in its history, the biggest police union in New Jersey decided to endorse a president in the 2020 election, and it chose to endorse Donald Trump. And that, I think, is really concerning and something that sort of tells you where its head is at when it's thinking about what justice should look like in the United States.
Thank you so much, CJ and Amol, both of you, for that really wonderful history on both of those legislation and just for this issue in New Jersey in general. So the next question is, New Jersey has the worst Black-white racial disparity in incarceration rates in the country, with Black adults being 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than white adults, and Black youth being over 20 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth. I believe Latino youth are, the Latino white youth incarceration gap is the third worst in the country as well. So it's not just for the Black-white gap. So how can we address this issue, and what, if any, role does policing play in this disparity? And anyone can start, or I can pick someone if you prefer.
So I'll start, and I'll turn to Karen in a sec. I think all of us have a lot to say about this. To your last question, what role do police have in mass incarceration? I think Alexis was answering that in her previous remarks. Police are the entry point for the criminal legal system, right? There are so many interactions that happen that are racially motivated and have a disproportionate impact on Black communities that lead to fueling the mass incarceration system that we are seeing. And New Jersey is of course no exception, except that it is the worst, right? And so the problem that we are seeing, that we're identifying as mass incarceration, really is a problem of multiple aspects of the criminal legal system working together, leading to that situation. But the entry point is police, and as a result, every step of the way as you advance through the criminal legal system is tainted with that bias and that prejudice that exists at the street level with police interactions. And so I think that is, what I would say about police's role in order to dismantle the system of mass incarceration and the racial disparities that exist. One of the things that we need to do is just, first of all, question whether we need to be criminalizing all of the things that we criminalize in American society, determine whether or not police should have as much power as they do to make pretextual stops and uproot people's lives the way they can, and also simultaneously reduce significantly the prison population. There is no reason why we have as many people incarcerated as we do. In fact, one of our greatest achievements as an organization in our history was something that we called the Public Health Emergency Credit, which allowed for people to be released early during this time of our pandemic, right? And we led to the release of almost 4,000 people so far, which is over 25% of the prison population in New Jersey. And the world didn't explode, right? The sky didn't fall. There are now 4,000 people that are home and safely able to properly isolate, not without challenges. Like, there are going to be individual challenges when people are released from prison because we just don't have enough supports and a social structure that allows to help people and give them what they need. But we have seen no uptick in crime. Those fear-mongering talking points from the police union and elsewhere, every time you try to think about releasing people from prison, really have no fruit and really have no merit. So I think it's really important for us to think about ways in which we can reduce the number of people who are incarcerated. But I want to turn to Karen, Alexis, and CJ, who are wonderful experts in all of these things.
And really quickly before Karen, I'm so sorry, please go ahead in a minute. I just want to let you know if anyone has any questions, we are going to turn the conversation over to the audience Q&A very, very shortly. So please put them in the chat. We're hoping to do that around 8:06 or 8:07-ish. So please go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Amol said, I think that we just argued a trio of cases in front of the New Jersey Supreme Court that I think exemplify this issue. Like when we talk about racial disparities, we're talking about people in prison and they had to get there somehow, right? And the fact that there's so many disparities, you can have basically only two explanations: that people of color are just inherently more criminal, which is not true, or that there is something happening that is sweeping up people of color into this pipeline to get them into the prisons, which, as we know, are money-making operations, right? So to make money, you have to make sure that there are people in the prisons to populate them. And what we see is all of the kind of hooks, all of the ways that we get people into that pipeline. So just this year, we argued a case called State v. Garcia, which involved prosecutorial misconduct, where the prosecutor basically lied about a defendant's self-defense claim. He was sent to prison basically because of what the prosecutor represented in his closing statement. We argued that the Supreme Court found that that prosecutor's behavior was totally unconstitutional, and Mr. Garcia was actually released 2 months ago. Then we argued a case called State v. Andujar, which some of you may have heard of, which involved a Black man from Newark who showed up to jury duty. The prosecutor asked questions during voir dire, or the judge asked questions, and the prosecutor wasn't happy with the answers. And the judge still found that juror was perfectly able to serve. He didn't have a history. He was over 18. He could understand English. He fit all of the criteria for being a juror. And unhappy with that, the prosecutor had the juror arrested when he showed up for jury duty the next day. We argue that, and our hope is that the court will agree with us that that sort of behavior is incredibly unconstitutional and chills a defendant's right to have a jury of their peers. And just 2 weeks ago, we argued another case called State v. Rosado, which involved a police officer making a stop based on the fact that 10% of the garden state on the bottom of your license plate, which I'm sure you have, was covered by a frame, by a license plate frame. And based on that, the police officer stopped this gentleman and then proceeded to conduct a criminal investigation. And he stated himself under oath that these traffic stops are used to develop those criminal investigations and to kind of evade reasonable suspicion, right? So this is what I was kind of referring to earlier. When the system is set up to do something very particular, it does exactly what it is set to do. And so we have to actually look, as part of the question about how to make accountability, how to have transparency, how to make sure that there are consequences for bad behavior, that has to also involve prosecutors, because they are a part of this law enforcement apparatus. And so I think that's an issue. And I also just want to point out that New Jersey has some serious race problems, right? I think we'd like to think of New Jersey as really progressive. It's a northeastern state, all of this stuff. But the fact of the matter is New Jersey refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. It took them about 20 years to actually ratify it. New Jersey has some very deep ties to the slave state, or a slave owning state, for quite a while. And all of that has really informed a lot of the kind of racial temperature of the state. And that has created this kind of very odd imbalance, because we also have an idea of freeholders, and New Jersey has this very great idea of the people having a voice. But at the same time, we have this very huge schism of kind of racial inequity that has been cooked into the cake. And so we have a lot of work to do, and all of these threads inform it.
Thank you so much, Karen. Alexis, did you want to add anything, or?
I'll just add really quickly that I think one of the really important things to keep in mind is when it comes to thinking about things like youth incarceration and the major racial disparities we have, is thinking about our investments as a state, where we're putting money, and just the many millions of dollars that we spend to incarcerate, not a huge number, but the disparities are unbelievable, to incarcerate Black and brown kids, basically. And so I'm a big fan of thinking about, if we took that, I believe the number is $54 million or so we spend annually to incarcerate those kids. Is there a better use for that money that could prevent them from being engaged in whatever behavior has been deemed criminal in the first place? And I also would just add really quickly, in part because I'm a relatively new New Jerseyan, only been here a few years, a new suburbanite. I feel like the structural issues are really important to think about, and particularly surveillance. And I say surveillance, and your mind might go to, something kind of sophisticated, whether it's cameras or something else. But I mean, just literally having eyes on kids, and who are the kids who have eyes on them all the time, who have police eyes on them all the time? How is that different in cities as opposed to the suburbs? I think those are some of the questions we should be thinking about when we want to get serious about addressing those kinds of racial disparities.
Thank you so much, Alexis. So I am going to turn it over to Afsheen now to ask some of the questions from the audience. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much to our panelists and to Raisa. With the audience Q&A portion, I'm going to get us started with an op-ed in the NJ.com that talks about the status of police accountability and police reform bills in the state legislature. And our first question pertains to precisely that question. What is the status of all pending police-related bills in state legislature, and what has been the ACLU's communication? And I'm gonna tag on a second question, which is similar, which is, are the bills being stalled in Assembly or Senate, or is leadership in both bodies equally unwilling to bring them up for a vote? Has legislative leadership articulated specific concerns that are holding these up?
That's a lot. So I think I'll take one aspect of it, which is basically that we are currently engaged. We're speaking to both senators and assembly folks to think of the best way to advance these bills. I can't say that there's an overwhelming push to make it happen. People say that they're interested and that they support them, but we're not necessarily seeing the movement happening as fast as we would like. As CJ mentioned earlier, Senator Weinberg has sponsored it, and we're hoping that this is one of the last things that she does before she retires. But unfortunately, I think what we're seeing a lot of is, oh, well, we did stuff last year, so we're done. Like that there's this kind of scarcity mentality around equity when it comes to criminal justice. And so if we give you a cookie here, then we're done. No more cupcakes, no more anything else. And I think what we're trying to say is, not only is it not enough, but for all of these things to actually truly create reform, for us to actually move forward in a place that is real, that has lasting effects, that has accountability, that shifts this conversation, then it's not just one thing that has to happen. We've got our 2656 for transparency. We have our CCRB bill, which is Senate Bill 2963, but we also have a use of force bill that's moving forward, which is in the Assembly, and that's 4526, and the chokehold bill, right? And so all of those threads, in addition to ending qualified immunity, that's what makes it strong. It's just not enough to pull one thread, because the whole thing is going to just unravel without anything solid in its place. And so the work continues. And as we mentioned again, you can be involved in it. You can call people, you can send letters, you can say, this is not enough. If you do want to honor the loss that Mr. Floyd's family is feeling, if you want to truly express that it's not acceptable for police to be able to use chokeholds, to be able to use force in that way against people, then this is what must happen. This is a change that has to be done, and all of these bills have to be passed together and now.
Afsheen, I think there was a question in there about the ACLU's communication, and I want to talk about the different threads of communication that we have. First of all, as Karen so eloquently put, we are before the legislature, talking to them all the time about all of these issues. We have a whole policy team that uses the subject matter expertise that our litigators bring, and talks to our lawmakers about what they can be doing to make New Jersey a better leader in police reform. Secondly, we are continuously communicating with stakeholders, and that includes other organizations. You know, the op-ed that you just put into the chat is authored by somebody from the Institute for Social Justice, who we work with very closely in our Police Reform Coalition. We are working with directly impacted community members and folks who have been impacted by policing. And you know, another sort of form of communication that we engage in is through the courts, right? Karen has just cited the several cases that she litigated to the Supreme Court, talking about you know, police accountability and the ways in which policing creates the problem of mass incarceration. So we're out there talking to the courts and using our legal system and the confines of it, which can be very confining, in order to effectuate change the best way we can. And lastly, we communicate with our members. So I hope you know, the folks on this call are all ACLU members. If you're not, I encourage you to join the ACLU. We send out action alerts to members. We engage them in whatever way we can. We have over 40,000 members across New Jersey, and that's a really important tool and a really important asset for us, because you know, that is powerful. That strength in numbers sort of you know, push that we can bring that is unique to the ACLU, and really sends a message to all of our lawmakers that, you know, we're not going to allow injustice to proceed without a check. That is really, really important. And I hope all of you consider joining the ACLU if you aren't already members.
Thanks so much for that, Karen and Amol. Our next question is there an issue with consistency between municipalities and compliance to the state's orders? What systems are in place to make sure police departments and individual municipalities are keeping up with state's policies?
Speak to that. So New Jersey is unique, and I think some of the problem with some of these bills being stalled is due to this uniqueness, that we put the Attorney General as the chief law enforcement officer in the state, which means the Attorney General is in charge of all the police departments and sort of uniform policies regarding them. And so in that, that's part of the problem, I think, because there's a lot of sort of passing the buck to the Attorney General always. And right now we are asking the legislature to be less hands-off and to actually, you know, legislate on policing issues. And, you know, the Attorney General sort of pushing it off as well. And so no one's taking responsibility and just making the changes that we need. But in terms of uniformity, theoretically, yes. But one thing that we have learned is that sometimes the Attorney General issues policies, but there's really then not any oversight to ensure that they're actually implemented from agency to agency. And so we've seen that in particular with like some of the transparency policies. I pay attention to those. In 2018, the Star Ledger NJ.com published a database of use of force reports, because the Attorney General's policy for 20 years has required police to create a form called a use of force report every time police officers use any level of force. And agencies would mostly do that, and then those forms would just sit in their police department, and there was never any statewide oversight or countywide oversight whatsoever over those forms. And it wasn't until 2018 when NJ.com published this amazing database that actually forced the Attorney General to sort of say like, oh yeah, we this is embarrassing, but we've never done any sort of oversight with that. And that's also true for other transparency provisions. So for example, every agency is supposed to have certain things on their website, one of which is called a disciplinary action report, which is supposed to give you a list of all the major misconduct that has happened over the past year. Now, it doesn't have it's never had names. The Attorney General's new directive would require the names to be attached. That's stayed in the Supreme Court, but they're supposed to publish at least this description that says a officer, no name, engaged in X conduct and was punished for X amount of days. And you're supposed to be able to just go to your agency's website, find out that information as well as statistics. But when you go to most agency websites, it's not there. They're not complying. State police are required by the AG's directives as well as by state law, a statute, to publish that data annually. They haven't published since 2017. So, those are just some examples of how there's not the sufficient level of management of police departments. And then we see, situations like Patterson happening, where now the prosecutor's office has to step in and take control because there's too much misconduct. But guess what? Patterson, the Passaic County prosecutor's office also doesn't comply with any of this. So it's this systemic problem that really needs like legislative fix.
Thanks so much, CJ. Anyone else want to weigh in on that before I move to the next question? Okay, so our final question of the evening is, what are some actions that the membership can take to most effectively advocate for police reform?
Karen's spoken about it several times, but again, when we meet with Senator Weinberg and other sponsors of the bill, what they say is that the lawmakers need to hear from people that this is a priority. They need to know that you care about this. And because the police unions are very powerful in this state, that's why all of these bills are defeated and why they're in court stamping down all progress that we have made. And so our voices have to be even louder than their voices. They have a lot of money to throw into it. They can make donations, all of that. We have to write them and let them know either by email, through the ACLU's tool that you posted a little bit ago, calling, just badgering them and letting them know that these bills are priorities to you. And that's the only way, once they see that grassroots support, which they're already commenting that they're hearing, because we've been doing a lot of work to get that in. That's the only way they're going to do it. They're not going to do it on their own because it's the right thing to do, which is, it is the right thing to do, but it's not, they're not going to do it until they hear from us.
And I think it's important, like I said before, because I think that they think, oh, we did things last year, so we're done. And I think what we all need to do is say, you are not done. Like, there is so much more. So it's about calling and saying, this is something I'm invested in, this is important to me, and that the work has to continue on. It's not enough to give just little drops. And just with regard to things like qualified immunity, I just want to put this to you, personally, as people going about your lives. If you went to get a manicure and you got a staph infection, or if something horrible happened while you were in the salon, there would be recourse. You'd be able to find out the background of that manicurist, right? If I represented you and I did something terrible, you could sue me for malpractice, right? We hold people accountable in almost every other context when they've done something wrong. But for some reason, for the people who have some of the most unlimited, most intense power in our society, the power to take someone's life, we don't hold them accountable. And so if that makes you a little bit horrified, if that feels like something that's not right, if that feels out of whack to you, it's because it is. So I hope that will motivate everybody to make sure that your electeds are responding to your concerns and those concerns, because having that accountability, knowing what's going on, that helps us trust each other, and it helps us trust those with the most power in our society.
Thanks so much, CJ and Karen. Yeah, go ahead, Mo.
All of those legislative actions are really, really important. Another, another thing that I'll mention, and I wouldn't be doing my job as an executive director if I didn't say this. I think it's incredibly important to support organizations. So an organization like the ACLU, of course, is there for you. There are other organizations out there that we work with routinely to advance police reform. Encourage supporting all of those organizations as well. But our work at the ACLU has really expanded over the time of the pandemic. I often say that we have more work than people to do it, and it is every time we hire somebody new, the areas that we have to operate in multiply, and we end up creating more and more work, recognizing that we need to do more and more work because there are just so many injustices that are surrounding us right now. And in New Jersey, we have this unique opportunity to be simultaneously reactive against all of the horrors that we're seeing in policing and other things, but also proactive in that we can advance change that is really meaningful, and not just on policing, but on other issues too, like immigrants' rights and reproductive health, prosecutor reform, things that are ripe for change right now in New Jersey, but just need that push in order for us to actually make it a reality. And I think through the ACLU and through other organizations that we work with, it's really important to have those voices at the table and represented, because otherwise, there are no watchdogs. And I think, organizations like ours, we have the great privilege of being able to be not only a thorn in the side of government, but also a credible and reliable voice and a resource for every institution and the public. And I hold that role that we have in society in such high regard and give it the respect that it deserves. And it's only possible because of the investment that our members and our supporters have trusted us with. So I want to say thank you and encourage all folks to get involved with the ACLU in whatever way, in whatever capacity they can.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Raisa, but quickly, I shared with you the ACLU New Jersey's tool where you can take action. Please do so tonight. In a bit, we'll be voting on the letter to support some of the legislation that is up in the state legislature. But before we do that, and also I want to encourage you to support the ACLU New Jersey and other organizations that are engaged in this work. There's so much work to be done, and we need to build capacity and strengthen the organizations that are actually doing this. So thank you to our amazing panelists. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Raisa to ask her to share closing thoughts with our panelists. So Raisa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So just because we have this, we have to discuss this letter very soon regarding what CJ discussed, around police transparency. I want to do very quick closing thoughts, if you could keep it to about a minute, and address, if you were given the opportunity, I know this is not easy to answer in a minute, but how would you reimagine the role of police in our society and in our state? So speed round, lightning round, whomever wants to start. Not all at once.
I'll go really quickly first. I guess I would say, as brutal and horrible as George Floyd's murder was, I am really grateful for the conversation it has started around the United States about policing. It's a little surreal when it's a topic that, for me personally, I've been thinking a lot about since that case I mentioned I was assigned about police in schools more than 10 years ago, to spend so much time thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, lots of people are paying attention and lots of people are thinking about it in a new way. But my really fundamental hope is that we collectively think hard about what we really need police for. Because I think we agree, and police departments agree as well, that they are doing too much. They're called into too many situations. And I would really encourage all of you in the Princeton community to think about that locally, that we should be thinking about it as a state. We should be thinking about it really in every way that we possibly can. What do we really want policing for? And how can we reimagine policing so that it accords with that vision?
I co-sign completely, and I think the only thing I would add is this is something Alexis said earlier as well. The money that we are spending that's being directed to support these things that police officers shouldn't even be involved in would be better redirected to serve the communities that are being so heavily policed. And so I'm hoping with things like our recent legalization of marijuana that we're going to see some of that funding pass through, that we're going to see communities being built up instead of torn down. And I think that those things go part and parcel with what Alexis said.
Yeah, I would just say I think we have to like address the myth that police officers hold about themselves as well as the public holds about police officers, which is that like we need them because they provide public safety. But 95% of what they do, even though they think the moment they leave their house is they're, you know, protecting people and investigating crimes, 90% of what they're doing actually is you know, giving traffic tickets and parking tickets and responding to noise complaints and all sorts of things that we don't really need police to do. And so I think at a minimum, we need to remove those jobs from police and take and significantly reduce police staff size and shift resources to other people to handle those. We don't need someone with a gun giving parking tickets or even traffic tickets. You know, so that's at a bare minimum, it's that. But I really, even this notion like that we still need the police to keep us safe, I think we really have to challenge that and whether it's true, because actually the police harm a lot of people and certainly don't make many more feel. I think, you know, what we, like I said at the beginning, what we've talked about tonight are reforms that are operating within the current system to try to make it a little better, to try to give us information to help us move things along. But ultimately, we have to be thinking outside the system and something completely different and not be afraid to say, like, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to operate within this framework anymore. We can have a different framework and still be safe and probably be safer. Let's eliminate the need for you know, for police because we put so much resources into the community that a lot of the community problems aren't there anymore.
I will echo everything my colleagues here said, and I'll add this. First of all, you know, I guess it's a related point to what everybody else said. We need to be willing to scrutinize police budgets at the local level. Like the idea that police departments can grow and invest over and over and over again. I was talking to a friend in another community who was telling me that that they can cut any budget of any department in any municipality, but they'll never touch the police budget. And that to me is really concerning, that we're not scrutinizing every dollar spent the way we are in other areas of municipal or state government. Another thing that I'll mention is the role of police unions in our society. I would, the way we need to make sure that we are really reimagining policing is, in addition to writing the policy on paper, we need to sort of dismantle the way lawmakers and others in power feel beholden to police unions, who oftentimes are there to maintain the status quo and obstruct reform. And it's really important that we take a hard look at, you know, what the police unions actually represent. You know, we often talk about police department diversity and how that may be a solution. I don't think it is, first of all. I think police department diversity is something that's important, of course, but it's not going to change police culture. But even if you believe in that idea of police department diversity, take a look at the diversity or lack thereof in police union leadership. You will not find it. And I think it's really important for us to take a hard look at police unions. And the last real quick thing that I'll say is more zoomed out here. Look, over the past several years, 4 years in particular, we have talked about how Donald Trump and other folks who followed his lead were threatening or obstructing or not adhering to some concept of the rule of law, right? Like this notion that we have that there's some objectivity in the rule of law and there's some integrity in it. But I'll posit that the rule of law over the course of our history has been used more for racial injustice and oppression than it has to meet the goals of justice. And I think it's really important for us to be willing to criticize the rule of law, criticize the implementation of these constitutional ideals that the ACLU oftentimes stands for, but we know so often fall short for the people that experience injustice every single day. And it's really important for us to make sure that we're questioning and being healthy skeptics of the institutions that serve us, because they themselves are not rooted in this objectivity. They are plagued with bias, and they themselves have systemic racism rife across every level. And it's really important for us as an organization and together as a community to dismantle and disrupt that.
Thank you so much to our incredible panel. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your insights. It's just such an honor to have you here. I will turn it back over to Afsheen to discuss the letter.
Thanks so much, Raisa, and thanks so much to our amazing panelists. Really, thank you for your leadership and your advocacy to advance justice and police reform in our state. I look forward to our members supporting you. Following this, this discussion, we will send out an email to our members asking them to take action. So thank you. And now our members actually have an opportunity to take action right now by voting on a letter that the PCDO would like to send on behalf of our 500 members, asking the state legislators to support this bill on police transparency that will open up records of police misconduct. I'm sharing the letter with you here now. And so I'd like to invite a motion to have the PCDO send this letter to our state legislators. Do we have a motion? Dozier, you have the floor. So we have a motion.
I move that we approve the ACLU 4 actions on police accountability.
A second.
Thank you. Thank you for that second. All in favor, wave, thumbs up, any emoji on your screen, any reaction on your screen, thumbs up or wave. Okay, I'm looking through our screens right now. All in favor, that's it. We have a lot of ayes. Any opposition? Okay. No opposition, abstentions? And the motion carries. Thank you. So thanks to our membership here tonight and the Advocacy Committee's work, we will be sending this letter to our state legislators to support the work of all these amazing advocates and leaders who are working on this issue. And so thank you for supporting that work. I want to take a moment to also thank our distinguished panelists for all they're doing to advance police reform at the state level. It is indeed time to reimagine the role of police, and we thank you for all your leadership and advocacy on this front. Many thanks to our amazing moderator and PCDO's youngest executive board member, Raisa, for a great job moderating tonight's panel, and many thanks to all of our members for supporting our advocacy committee's work tonight. I encourage you to also support the good work of the ACLU New Jersey as they champion police reform at the state level. Thank you for joining us tonight, and good night.